Hey everyone, I wanted to go ahead and have a quick discussion regarding some of the changes that we got to see in the latest patch version 12.00 or free title update number 2, specifically when it comes to some of the melding option changes that we got to see in this most latest patch for Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Now, I originally mentioned when I went over the patch notes that they were rather lengthy, so it doesn't necessarily surprise me that this was essentially buried all the way at the bottom. But if you weren't necessarily reading all of the patch notes, you most likely glossed it over and completely missed it. But it turns out that they made some interesting changes specifically for those of you who are making use of the Melding Reincarnation Melding Pod option. So according to the patch notes, they mentioned that they increased the chance of getting secondary skills on a Talisman when using said reincarnation option in the melding market. So essentially the one where you are kind of like repurposing already claimed talismans. Whenever you get a talisman that is not necessarily something you want to keep, something that you don't necessarily want to lock, you can essentially repurpose it. You trade in 10 of those talismans in the reincarnation options. I think it costs you like 1,000 points, and then you can actually go ahead and get 3 random talismans in return. And of course, like any sort of talisman trade-ins, not only do you have the option to actually go do a hunt and be able to just let it take its time, or if you use an MP accelerant, you can instantly go ahead and get your rewards instantly right out of the gate. So what I ended up doing was 5 separate instances of 30 talismans each. So essentially you trade in 300 talismans to get 30. And I ended up doing that 5 different times. So I ended up trading in 1,500 talismans to be able to get back 150. And what I was looking for wasn't necessarily finding some sort of god tier talisman or anything along those lines. Obviously, the patch notes don't necessarily tell you that you have a better chance to be able to get better rewards or better talismans automatically out of the gate with the reincarnation option. You're supposed to kind of like built in already have a better chance to be able to have better rewards, better talismans being handed to you. But what the real change here is of course the fact that now a secondary skill is supposed to be showing up more times than not. And that's pretty much all I was trying to look into. See what the percentages was for me to be able to get a secondary skill whenever I got in a brand new recycled talisman from the reincarnation melding option. Now I know that pre-patch the chances of you actually just being able to get a 1 skill talisman, not necessarily 2 skill talismans, was anywhere from 20 to 40%. It really varied. It wasn't necessarily like one of those things where like you could just kind of like repeat over and over. Numbers wise, from what I saw a lot of people report, where we're just pretty much random. You could have a lot of talismans that would just give you 1 skill, and then a lot of depending on the run or the return, you would end up getting like 2 skills. So it was just pretty much rather random. What I ended up finding out this time around with the 1,500 talismans that I traded in and the 150 that I got back, I did 5 separate batches. So like I mentioned before, I got 30 talismans, and I noticed that on the first batch, I ended up getting 5 talismans out of 30. That would be 16.6% that did not have a double skill. So what I ended up noticing is that as I did subsequent batches, batch number 2, 3, 4, and 5, usually the rarer their skill was, that was the one that didn't necessarily end up getting a second skill. So it was one of those things where like obviously the more common skills have a better chance to be able to have a subsequent rarer skill, but the first skill, usually if it's a rare one, then it has a lower chance for you to be able to have a secondary skill. Now the slots for the talismans themselves, those are completely random. Of course, that's all RNG. We know that already. Another thing I certainly want to point out is that you cannot reset this like we could before they patched it out. I believe like 2-3 patches ago by now. Remember that I covered how you could actually reset and all of that for you to be able to get like different results. You can't do that anymore. So what you can actually do is get better results on a second skill, but not necessarily guarantee that you're going to be able to get different rerolls every single time you try to do this. Now in the second batch of talismans that I traded in, the 300, and I ended up getting 30 back, another 5 out of 10 ended up being only 1 skill talismans. So that was another 16.6%. On the third batch, I ended up seeing the most amount. That was 8 talismans with just 1 skill, not a second skill showed up. So only 22 of the talismans ended up having double skills. And that was a 26.6% of like not double skill talismans. When it came to the fourth batch, I ended up getting 7 talismans out of 30 that had only 1 skill, so that was 23.3%. And lastly, on the 5th batch, I ended up noticing that only 4 talismans out of 30, that would be a 13.3%, ended up having just 1 skill. So all in all, what I ended up noticing was that 29 talismans out of 150, that would be 19.3%, ended up just showing up with 1 specific skill, not a secondary skill. So usually what you could probably expect, let's say rounded out from 19.3, let's say to 20%, 1 out of every 5 talismans that you end up getting in return, chances are will not have a secondary skill, with the understanding that chances are those talismans are going to be with rarer skills tied to them. So whatever the main skill that you're going to have there is going to be one of those grade A or grade S type of skills. I'm going to be showing you a chart right there on the screen right now. This is pretty much one of those charts that people came up with as they kind of like show you based on like the data mines, pretty much like what are the chances for you to be able to have like what skills, what slots, what the secondary skill could be. And when you look at the grades, essentially they show you like which skills are like considered rarer than others. Grade S and A are like the rarest ones. Those are the ones that you certainly want to find the most talismans of, because they're basically like the best skills. B and C are pretty much lesser tiers. So you don't necessarily need to focus on trying to make sure getting all of those skills, then you can have them as a secondary skill in another like talisman. More importantly, of course, the slots was really important specifically for this table. But if you kind of like just look at it for like the rarity of the skill, that's kind of like what I'm trying to point out. Most talismans that I ended up getting that were only 1 specific skill were of the S or A tier, essentially a rarer type of skill. For whatever reason, those were not necessarily netting me a second skill. Now, that doesn't mean that they were the only ones. There was like plenty of ones. I didn't necessarily find any really good talismans or anything like that. But when it came, one of the like clearest things that I noticed was that most of the talismans that had just 1 skill ended up being tier S or tier A. So that's, I guess, the real point of like what I'm trying to point out. There's going to be a 20% chance that you're going to be able to find one of those, but they're not necessarily going to come with a secondary skill. So ultimately, is it really worth it? And ultimately, do they have the slots that you necessarily need? It's all going to be based on the RNG. So the reincarnation changes that we got specifically for this patch, they're good, but they're not necessarily great. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you still need to have, like I mentioned, I traded in 1,500 talismans to just be able to get 150. So it's one of those things where like, the trade-in is just, it really varies, and the RNG is still gonna, rule over everything. So, it is what it is. Hopefully I've been able to shed some sort of light specifically on this patch note changes, since of course I haven't necessarily seen anyone else cover this. So I thought I certainly should give it a shot and report my findings. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.